My new neighbor, a elderly woman, moved into the vacant house next door after 2 years of silence. A few weeks later, one afternoon, she knocked and handed me a sealed envelope. "Don't open it until 11 o'clock tonight," she said. "And tonight, whatever you see outside, don't leave the house." Why, I asked, my hands growing cold. She simply replied, "You'll understand." That night at exactly 11 o'clock, I stood in the darkness looking out, and in that moment, my whole body stiffened. If you found your way here today, I'm truly grateful. Before the story starts, leave me a comment. Where are you from your city, your corner of the world? I want to know who's in this room with me. Just so you know, this story blends fictional elements with storytelling, crafted to educate and reflect. Names and locations are coincidental, but the lesson at the heart of it is something I hope stays with you. The knife moves slowly across the cutting board, turning an ordinary apple into something a little boy would actually want to eat. I wasn't fast at it anymore. My hands didn't cooperate the way they used to, but I was careful. That part hadn't changed. Each slice came down at an angle, then sideways, until the pale wedge of fruit looked something like a rabbit sitting up on its haunches. 2 small triangles for ears. A rounded body. It wasn't perfect. It never was. But every morning for the past 7 months, Stellan had sat down at that table, looked at his plate, and smiled. That was enough for me. My name is Harlan Decker. I'm 71 years old, and I live in a 2-story wood frame house on Maple Grove Drive in Cedar Falls, Iowa. I've lived in this house for 38 years. I raised my son here. I grew old here with my wife. And now, on a quiet Monday morning in early September of 2024, with the maple trees outside the kitchen window just beginning to let go of their green, I was standing at my cutting board making rabbit-shaped apples for my 6-year-old grandson. Life has a way of circling back on itself when you least expect it. I heard him, before I saw him, the soft thud of small feet on the stairs, the particular sound of a child who is awake but not yet fully present in the world. Stellan appeared in the kitchen doorway, wearing the blue pajamas with the rocket ships on them, his dark hair standing up on one side, eyes blinking slowly against the morning light. "Grandpa Harlan," he said in that voice that always made me feel like the world was smaller and warmer than it actually was. "Did you make the rabbits?" "I did," I said, setting his plate on the table. "2 of them today." He climbed into his chair and studied the apple slices with the gravity of a man inspecting important documents. Then he picked one up and took a bite. I poured his orange juice and turned back to the stove. Outside, a cardinal landed on the fence post at the edge of the yard, sat there for a moment, then was gone. Cedar Falls doesn't make much noise this early. That's one of the things I've always loved about it. There was a chair at the corner of the kitchen table that I hadn't moved in 8 months. Eleanor used to sit there every morning, right-hand side, diagonal from the window, so she could see both the backyard and the front street at the same time. She liked to know what was going on, she always said. I used to tease her about it. Every morning I still set a cup of tea at that chair, Earl Grey the way she took it. I didn't drink it. I didn't pour it out right away either. It just sat there while Stellan and I had breakfast, and I let myself believe just for a little while that the house wasn't as empty as it actually was. Eleanor passed in January. Pancreatic cancer, the kind that doesn't give you much warning and even less time. 4 months from diagnosis to the end. She was gone before the last snow of winter had melted off the front walk. And then February came, and with it, Prescott's situation. My son is 38 years old. I will not spend a great deal of time explaining who Prescott is or what he had done, because the full shape of that story took me a long time to understand myself. What I will say is this: when the court contacted me in late February and asked whether I was willing to take temporary guardianship of Stellan while Prescott's case moved through the system, I said yes before the sentence was finished. Stellan was standing at my front door with a small blue suitcase, the one with the airplane on the zipper pull, and his eyes were red in the way that told me he had been crying recently, but had. Stopped because he was trying very hard to be brave. He looked up at me and said, "Hi, Grandpa Harlan," in a voice so small it nearly undid me. Yeah, I crouched down to his level and said, "This is your home now, Stellan, for as long as you need." That was 7 months ago. 7 months of rabbit-shaped apples and bedtime stories and Saturday morning cartoons, and learning together what it means to make a family out of the pieces that remain when everything else falls away. 7 months I would not trade for anything in the world. Do you think Grandma can still see us? Stellan asked, looking at Eleanor's empty chair. I looked at that chair, at the cooling cup of tea at the morning light, falling across the seat of it, almost like it was placed there on purpose. I think she never stopped, I said. He picked up his fork and went back to his apple rabbit. And I went back to the stove, and the morning continued the way mornings do. That evening I sat on the front porch with a cup of coffee that had gone cold. Across the street, old Walter was walking his beagle. 2 doors down, the Harrigan kids had left their bikes on the lawn again. Everything exactly as it had been for 38 years, except for the house next door. Tonight there was light, a single lamp glowing behind the front window, faint and unfamiliar. Someone was moving in. The week moved the way early September weeks do in Cedar Falls, slow and golden, the kind of days that feel borrowed from summer, even as the trees begin letting go. Stellan started first grade that Monday. I walked him to the end of the driveway, watched the school bus take him away, and stood there longer than I needed to. Old habits from raising Prescott, I supposed. Some things don't change no matter how many years pass. It was Saturday morning when my son called. "Hey, Dad." His voice on the phone was easy, unhurried. "I'm thinking about swinging by today if that works. Bring Stellan something. Maybe stay for lunch." I looked out the kitchen window. Stellan was in the backyard, crouched over something in the grass, an insect probably, or a pebble that had caught his eye. 6-year-olds find the world endlessly interesting in ways the rest of us have mostly forgotten. "Sure," I said. "Come on by." I set the phone down on the counter and stood there for a moment. There was something I always felt when Prescott called, not dread exactly, and not quite relief. Something in between that I'd never found the right word for. He was my son. I loved him the way you love something you made and raised and poured yourself into. But loving a person and understanding them are 2 different things. And with Prescott, I had spent the better part of his adult life trying to close the distance between those 2. He arrived just after 11. I heard the car in the driveway before I saw it, that late model sedan. He drove black and always cleaned the kind of car that announces a certain kind of ambition. He came through the front door with a wide smile and a paper shopping bag folded over at the top, the kind they tie with ribbon at the nicer stores downtown. "Dad." He shook my hand, then pulled me into a quick embrace. He smelled like cologne, something expensive applied lightly. "You look good. You sleeping okay?" "Well enough," I said. He set the bag on the kitchen counter and pulled out a box wrapped in dark green paper. Inside was a glass bottle, heavy and clean-lined, with a label I didn't recognize. Premium Daily Supplements, it read, in the kind of font that was designed to make you feel you were buying something serious. 8 months of taking care of a 6-year-old at 71, Prescott said, and his voice carried the warmth of a man genuinely concerned. "You need to be taking care of yourself too, Dad." Eleanor would have said the same thing. He set the bottle on the kitchen counter next to the fruit bowl, like it belonged there. 1 in the morning, 1 at night, that's all. I picked it up and turned it over in my hands. The glass was smooth and cool. I thought about Eleanor, about how she used to line up my blood pressure medication on the windowsill so I wouldn't forget, and how after she was gone, I'd had to start writing myself notes. It was a kind thing for Prescott to do. I told myself that. "Thank you," I said. That was thoughtful. He nodded once, already looking toward the backyard. "Is he out there?" Stellan had heard the car. He came in through the back screen door at a run sneakers, squeaking on the linoleum, and launched himself at his father with the automatic energy of a child who is young enough that affection is still mostly physical. Prescott caught him, lifted him, held him up in the air the way kids love. Stellan laughed. But when Prescott set him back down and crouched to look at him, Stellan's eyes went somewhere else, to the floor, to the window, anywhere but straight ahead. It lasted only a second. The kind of thing you notice and then almost immediately convince yourself you imagined. After lunch, the 2 of them went out to the backyard. I watched from the kitchen window while I washed dishes. Prescott had found Stellan's soccer ball in the garage, and they were kicking it back and forth across the yellowing grass. Prescott was laughing, calling out encouragement, in the loud performative way of a man who wants to be seen being a good father. And Stellan was smiling, running after the ball, doing what children do, participating, being present, going through the motions of the moment. But he didn't grab his father's hand, didn't ask to be lifted again, didn't lean in. I told myself I was reading too much into things. Before he left, Prescott stood in the front hallway and took a moment to ask about the guardianship timeline. His tone was casual, almost indifferent the way people sound when they want you to believe something doesn't matter to them. He asked how long the temporary arrangement was expected to go on, whether I'd spoken to any attorneys, whether the court had given me any indication of the next hearing date. I answered honestly. I didn't have a reason not to. What I noticed, and I noticed it the way you notice something from the corner of your eye, not directly, was that while I was talking, Prescott wasn't quite looking at me. He was listening carefully, but his eyes were moving in small degrees, taking inventory of something I couldn't name. Then he turned to Stellan, who was standing near the stairs with his shoes back on, ready to wave goodbye. Prescott pulled the boy close and held him for longer than usual. He bent his head and said something quietly into Stellan's ear. Just a few words, the kind of thing that looks like an ordinary farewell from the outside. Stellan went very still for a moment. Then he nodded once small and deliberate. "What did Dad say, buddy?" I asked after the car had backed out of the driveway and the sound of the engine had faded down the street. Stellan looked at the floor. His sneaker traced a slow line across the rug. "Nothing, Grandpa," he said. "Just nothing." I didn't push. He was 6 and kids carry things sometimes, and I told myself it was nothing. I told myself that several times. That night, I shook 2 capsules from the new bottle into my palm, the way Prescott had shown me, and swallowed them with a glass of water before bed. I set the bottle on the nightstand and turned off the lamp. The room went dark. Outside the street was quiet, the way Cedar Falls gets quiet after 9, completely, almost completely. Except that at the far end of the block, where the streetlight didn't reach something, moved. A shape low and slow there for a moment, and then not. I lay there in the dark and told myself it was nothing too. I was at the sink finishing up the breakfast dishes when I heard it, the low diesel groan of a moving truck working its way down Maple Grove, then the long hydraulic exhale as it pulled to a stop. I dried my hands and leaned toward the window above the sink. The house next door had been empty for nearly 2 years. The previous owners, a retired couple named the Farrells, had moved south to be closer to their daughter after Mr. Farrell's second hip surgery. The place had sat quiet ever since curtains drawn lawn going patchy, the kind of stillness that starts to feel permanent after a while. I had made a few calls to the property management company about the overgrown hedges along our shared fence line, but nothing much ever came of it. Now there was a truck idling in the driveway, and 2 men in gray t-shirts were unloading furniture with the practiced efficiency of people who did this every day. Standing in the middle of it all, clipboard in hand, was a woman. She looked to be in her mid to late 60s, silver-haired upright, in the way of someone who had spent years in rooms where posture mattered. She wasn't directing the movers so much as monitoring them the way a person does when they know exactly where everything belongs, and are simply making sure it gets there. Her eyes moved over each piece of furniture. As it came off the truck, a quick assessing glance, and then she'd nod once and mark something on her clipboard. Stellan appeared at my elbow. He'd heard the truck, too. "Grandpa, should we bring something over?" he asked. I looked down at him, and for a moment I saw Eleanor standing there instead. Eleanor, who had baked a coffee cake the afternoon the Petersons moved into the house across the street back in 1991. Who had believed firmly that new neighbors deserved a warm welcome and a reason to feel like they'd landed somewhere worth staying. "Yeah," I said, "I think we should." I put an apple pie together from scratch, the same recipe Eleanor had used, the one she kept written, on a card tucked inside the cover of her old joy of cooking. Stellan sat at the kitchen table and watched me work, asking questions the way 6-year-olds do, each one following the last without pause. "Why do you put lemon juice in? Why does the crust have to be cold? Why does it smell different when it's cooking than when it's done?" I answered everyone. That's what mornings were for. The pie came out even golden crusted, smelling like every good autumn I could remember. I wrapped it in a dish towel and walked next door with Stellan at my side, his hand in mine. The woman answered the door before I knocked. She must have seen us coming up the front walk. Up close, her face was precise and composed, the kind of face that had learned over a long time not to give away more than it intended to. But her eyes were different, sharp in a way that was hard to describe, like they were doing 2 things at once, taking in what was in front of them, and simultaneously filing it away somewhere for later. "Hello," I said. "I'm Harlan Decker from next door. This is my grandson Stellan. We wanted to welcome you to the neighborhood." She looked at the pie for a half second before she took it. Then she smiled, and the precision in her face softened just slightly. "Cordelia Marsh," she said. "Thank you, Mr. Decker. That's very kind." She invited us in. The front room was still half-furnished, boxes stacked along one wall, but she'd already arranged a sitting area near the front window, 2 chairs, a small table, a floor lamp lit against the gray morning. A row of potted chrysanthemums sat on the porch steps outside, deep orange and rust-colored, the only things that looked fully settled. We sat and she poured coffee she'd already made. She asked about the neighborhood, about Cedar Falls, and then, in the natural way, conversations drift about Stellan and me. I found myself answering more than I had planned to, which was unusual for me. She had a way of asking questions that felt like ordinary conversation, but covered a great deal of ground. At some point I asked where she'd come from. "Des Moines most recently," she said. "But I grew up here actually, on Birchwood 3 blocks east. I've been meaning to come back for years, retire somewhere that feels like home." She paused and something shifted briefly behind her eyes, too quick to read. The timing just worked out. I nodded. I didn't ask what she meant by that. When Stellan and I got home, I put him down for his afternoon nap and settled into the armchair with the newspaper I hadn't gotten around to reading all week. Outside, the light had gone soft and yellow, the way it does in Iowa in late September. I must have dozed off. I woke to silence and then to the sound of Stellan coming down the stairs. His footsteps were slower than usual. His face was pale, not sick pale, but the particular pallor of a child who has woken from something he doesn't want to have seen. He sat on the edge of the sofa and pulled a throw pillow into his lap. "You okay, bud?" I asked. He nodded, but he was looking at the floor. "Grandpa," he said finally, "I have a secret. I kept my voice easy." "What kind of secret?" He shook his head slowly. "I can't tell. Dad said if I tell something bad will happen." I reached over and put my hand over his, gently, no pressure. He didn't pull away. I sat with him until he asked if we could watch a movie, and we did, and by dinner time he seemed more himself. But I wasn't. I sat in the dark living room long after Stellan had gone to bed. I wasn't ready to call what I was feeling alarm, not yet. Kids carry things. Kids repeat things. It didn't have to mean what it felt like it meant. And then I saw the figure at the end of the block. Same end of the street as before. Same absence of light. This time, he wasn't moving. He was standing still facing the house. And he stood there long enough that I stopped telling myself I was imagining things. The first night I told myself it was just a dream. The second night I sat up in bed and listened until the sound faded, then convinced myself the same thing. The third night I was already awake before Stellan made a sound. I don't know how to explain that. Maybe old men develop a kind of radar after enough years of loss, a low, quiet frequency that hums in your chest when something nearby is wrong. I lay in the dark with my eyes open, staring at the ceiling, and I just knew. Before his door creaked, before that small muffled sound drifted down the hallway and found me in the dark, I was out of bed before I had time to think about it. The hallway between our rooms isn't long, maybe 12 steps. But those 12 steps at 2 a.m, when the house is completely still and your 6-year-old grandson is crying behind a half-closed door, feel like the longest walk you've ever taken. I stopped just outside, put my hand on the doorframe, listened. It wasn't a nightmare kind of crying. It wasn't loud or panicked. It was the kind of crying a child does when they've been doing it for a while, quiet and exhausted, like they already know crying won't fix anything. That sound hit me somewhere behind the sternum and didn't let go. I pushed the door open slowly. The star-shaped nightlight on his dresser cast the room in pale gold. His teddy bear, a fat brown thing he had named Captain, for reasons he never explained, was wedged under his arm, and Stellan had his face turned toward the wall, shoulders hitching in small, tired shudders. I crossed the room and sat on the edge of the mattress. Didn't say anything at first, just put my hand on his back and kept it there. After a minute, the shuddering slowed. "Hey," I said. He turned over. His eyes were red, his face damp. He looked at me, the way children look at you when they've been alone with something too long, like they'd almost given up on someone showing up. "Hey, Grandpa." "Bad dream." He hesitated. That hesitation told me everything, but I waited. "I don't know," he said. I smoothed the blanket over his legs. The room smelled like fabric softener, and something faintly like the cedar chips Eleanor used to keep in the closets. I hadn't changed much in his room since she died. I don't think either of us wanted me to. "You've been awake a few nights," I said carefully. "I've heard you." He looked at me, looked away. 3 days ago, he'd said something that I'd been carrying around like a stone in my coat pocket, one of those things you keep reaching in to touch without quite being ready to put it down. "I can't tell." Dad said if I tell something bad will happen. I'd told myself he was tired, that he was adjusting, that children say things. But sitting here in the dim gold light at 2 in the morning, watching my grandson stare at the ceiling like he was bracing for something, I was done telling myself that. "Stellan," I said, "has your dad been coming here at night?" The silence lasted about 4 seconds. I counted. "Sometimes," he whispered. I kept my voice steady. "What does he do when he comes? He just..." Stellan pulled Captain tighter under his arm. "He says it's our special time, that I have to be quiet so we don't wake you up." A pause. "He says if I tell you the judge will give me to strangers, that you can't keep me if people find out." My hand on his back didn't move. I made sure of that. The anger came fast and white-hot, but I had enough left in me to know that what Stellan needed right now was not for me to show it. "Did your dad ever hurt you?" I asked. Quiet. Direct. The way the school counselor pamphlet on Cordelia's kitchen counter had said to ask something I'd glanced at without meaning to when I dropped off her pie dish last week. Stellan shook his head, but his eyes went to the window, not to me, and his small body went rigid in a way that 6-year-olds' bodies shouldn't. I didn't push. I tucked the blanket tighter and stayed until his breathing evened out, until Captain the teddy bear slid an inch in his loosening grip, until the room felt like a room again, instead of a confessional booth. Then I went downstairs. I don't know what I was looking for exactly moving through the dark kitchen without turning the lights on. Maybe just to do something with my hands with the cold anger sitting in my chest. I checked the front door, checked the living room windows, moved to the back of the house. That's when I found it. The back door has a deadbolt I installed, the winter after Eleanor died. Solid brass schlag, brand the kind a locksmith friend of mine said would hold against anything short of a battering ram. I ran my thumb along the plate and felt it before I saw it in the dark, a fresh scratch along the lower edge of the bolt housing, new metal shining through the old finish. Not deep enough to suggest forced entry, just enough to suggest someone had tried, or someone had left it there on purpose. I stood in the dark kitchen with my hand on that lock for a long time, turning it over in my mind. Prescott had a key to this house. He'd had one for years. If he wanted to come in, he didn't need to scratch at a deadbolt. So why was the mark there? The window above the sink faced the street. I looked out of habit. The silhouette was there again. Same spot as before, east end of Maple Grove near the old sycamore, still, watching. The orange glow of a distant streetlight made it impossible to see a face, only the shape of a person, standing in the particular stillness of someone who had decided not to move. Last time, I'd told myself it was a neighbor, someone walking a dog, my eyes playing tricks at midnight. This time, I didn't tell myself anything. I just stood there and looked back. And by the time the shape finally moved, stepping back slowly into the dark between two houses, I had already made up my mind. Whatever was happening inside my home and outside my front door, I was not going to wait any longer to find out. Tomorrow, I was making a call. The kitchen was quieter than usual that morning. I'd let Stellan sleep in something I almost never do because the boy wakes up with the kind of energy that makes you feel like the world is being restarted fresh each day. And I've come to depend on that. But after the night we'd had, I couldn't bring myself to pull back his curtains and call him down. Let him have whatever peace sleep could give him. He'd earned it. I stood at the kitchen counter with a mug of coffee I'd stopped tasting 20 minutes ago. The backyard was gray and still the maple trees dropping leaves in slow, reluctant spirals. Everything looked the way October looks when it's still technically September, that hollow transitional quiet before the cold really commits. On the counter just to my left sat Prescott's vitamin bottle. I looked at it for a while. Then I looked at my phone. His number was already on the screen. I'd pulled it up before the coffee finished brewing, but I hadn't pressed call yet, and it had been, I checked the clock nearly 10 minutes. It wasn't fear. I want to be clear about that. I stopped being afraid of my son somewhere around the time I watched him sign those guardianship papers in the county courthouse lobby 7 months ago. His pen moving with the practiced efficiency of a man checking off a task. Fear wasn't the right word for what I had felt that day, and it wasn't the right word now. What I needed was precision. Prescott had always been better with words than I was, faster, smoother, more comfortable with silence as a weapon. Every conversation with him since Eleanor died had felt like walking into a room where someone had rearranged the furniture slightly. Nothing you could point to exactly, but enough to make you careful about where you put your feet. I thought about what Stellan had said. He says it's our special time. He says if I tell you the judge will give me to strangers. I thought about the scratch on the back door lock. Then I thought about something older. 4 years ago, I'd filed a report with the Cedar Falls police about what Lavinia had shown up at our door with a split lip and eyes that wouldn't quite focus. Eleanor had held her in the kitchen for 2 hours while I sat in the living room and made myself make the call. Prescott was at work when the officers went to speak with him. By the time everything played out, Lavinia had retracted her statement, and the whole thing had dissolved into nothing. But I remembered the way Prescott had looked at me the next time I saw him. Not angry, something colder than angry. The kind of look that says, I'll remember this without ever needing to say a word. I pressed call. He picked up on the second ring. Dad. Warm, easy. Like a man who'd been expecting to hear from me and was genuinely pleased. Everything okay? How's Stellan? That's what I'm calling about, I said. I laid it out as plainly as I could. Stellan waking up crying for 3 consecutive nights. What he'd said about Prescott coming by during the hours I was asleep. The language special time the judge will give you to strangers. I kept my voice level. I'd spent 10 minutes composing this conversation in my head, and I was going to deliver it the way I'd planned. Prescott let me finish. That was the first thing he did. He let me finish completely without interrupting, which gave him the advantage of responding to the whole thing at once. Dad, he said slowly, like someone choosing words out of real concern. Stellan's been having night terrors. His pediatrician mentioned it at his last checkup. Did they tell you about that? Separation anxiety is really common in kids his age after a family transition. What he's describing, that's his brain trying to process everything, not something that actually happened. He was specific, Prescott. Kids are specific about their dreams. That's how they work. A brief pause. And Dad, I have to tell you something because I'm worried, and I don't want to say this the wrong way. His voice shifted lower, gentler, with just enough hesitation to sound reluctant. Stellan mentioned to me last week that you've been forgetting things. He didn't know the words for it. He just said sometimes you seem confused. I didn't say anything. I didn't want to bring it up, Prescott continued, because I know how independent you are, and I respect that. But you left the stove burner on twice last week, Stellan told me, and I'm not saying that to upset you. I'm saying it because I love you, and I need you to be okay. Are you taking those vitamins I brought? The B complex is specifically for cognitive support. Eleanor would have wanted you to. I'm fine, I said. The words came out more defensively than I intended. I know you are. I'm not saying you're not. He paused again. I'm just saying you've had an incredibly hard year. You lost Mom. You took in a 6-year-old. That's a lot for anyone, let alone... He didn't finish the sentence, but the shape of it hung there, let alone a man your age. I just want what's best for Stellan. I think you know the dad. You've always known that about me. The call ended 2 minutes later, with nothing resolved and everything rearranged. I stood on the back porch in the gray October air, still holding the phone, running back through the conversation, the way you replay a chess match after you've already lost. He hadn't denied anything directly. He'd explained it. He'd reframed it. And then he'd done the one thing I hadn't prepared for. He'd turned the lens around and pointed it straight at me. The stove. Had I left the burner on, I thought back. There had been a morning, maybe 2 weeks ago, when I'd gone upstairs to check on Stellan and come back down to find a burner still clicking on low. I'd assumed I'd just been distracted, but twice the word confused sat in my chest like a cold stone. I was 71 years old. I'd been exhausted. I'd been grieving. I'd been managing a household and a child and a legal situation that would strain someone half my age. It was natural to have moments of forgetfulness, distraction. It wasn't the same thing as what Prescott was implying. It couldn't be. Could it? Back in the kitchen, I stood at the counter for a moment before I reached for the vitamin bottle, unscrewed the cap, shook 2 capsules into my palm, and swallowed them with the last of my cold coffee. The logical part of my brain noted the irony without finding it funny. The more worried I was about my mind, the more faithfully I took the one thing my son had told me would help it. I set the bottle back on the counter. Then I looked out the window toward Cordelia's house. Her living room light was on, visible even in the midday gray, a warm amber square against the white clapboard siding. She'd been up early. She was almost always up early. I'd noticed that about her in the 2 weeks since she'd moved in the light on, before 6 still, on past noon, the particular schedule of a person who doesn't sleep the way ordinary people sleep. I went to the coat rack by the front door, pulled on my jacket. Whatever Prescott had planted in my head during that phone call, I wasn't going to sit alone with it. Not today. She opened the door before I reached the top step. Not like she'd been watching through a peephole, more like she'd simply known. The way certain people know things without being able to explain the mechanism, she looked at me for exactly 1 second, took in whatever she saw, and stepped back. "Come in, Harlan. I'll put the kettle on. No, is everything okay? No, what brings you by? No performing of surprise." Just the door held open, and the smell of Earl Grey already steeping somewhere inside. I stepped in and wiped my boots on her mat. Her living room stopped me for a moment. 2 weeks. She had lived here for 2 weeks, and the place looked like a woman who had spent a lifetime knowing exactly where she wanted everything. Bookshelves lined the far wall floor to ceiling, organized by category law history. What appeared to be a full shelf of case studies, another of child psychology texts. A Persian rug in deep burgundy. 2 armchairs angled toward each other, in the way that means this is where conversations happen. And on the wall above the fireplace mantel, a black and white photograph, a courthouse, wide steps, tall columns shot from across the street, taken from a distance like someone observing rather than celebrating. I didn't ask about it, but I looked at it. "Sit down," she said from the kitchen doorway. Not unkindly, the tone of someone who had learned through long practice that people think better when they're settled. I sat in the chair nearest the window and waited while she brought 2 cups on saucers, real china, the kind that makes a small, clear sound when you set it down. She sat across from me, folded her hands in her lap, and looked at me the way I imagined she had once looked at a great many people across a great many tables. Steady, patient, ears fully open. The look of someone who has heard enough versions of enough stories to know immediately when a person is telling the truth. "Tell me," she said, so I did. I told her about the 3 nights of crying, about what Stellan had said, special time the judge will give me to strangers, about the phone call with Prescott that morning, the way he'd flipped everything around the stove burner, the word confused, about the scratch on the back door lock that I still didn't have an explanation for. I didn't try to organize it into something that sounded sensible. I just said it in the order it had happened and let her make of it what she would. She didn't interrupt once. When I finished, the tea was still warm. She picked up her cup, took a measured sip, set it back down. "Mr. Decker." She said she'd called me Harlan at the door, but switched to formal address the way some people do when the conversation turns serious. "I've been watching your son." I kept my expression even. Watching him how, the way I watch most things carefully and from a sufficient distance. She glanced toward the window that faced Maple Grove. "The first time I noticed him, he was parked at the end of the block, not in front of your house, 2 houses down on the opposite side. He sat in the car for 40 minutes before he came to the door." She paused. "A father who misses his son, drives up east, gets out, knocks. He doesn't sit in a car for 40 minutes first." "He might have been on a phone call," I said. I don't know why I said it. Some residual loyalty, maybe. Or the habit of a man who has spent a lifetime trying to be fair. Cordelia looked at me without blinking. "He wasn't on a phone call," she said. "He was watching the house. There's a difference in how a person sits." I didn't argue that. "What else do you know?" I asked. She was quiet for a moment, the careful quiet of someone choosing a precise point on a line between what I know and what I'm ready to say. "Not yet," she said. "There are things I'm still verifying. When I'm certain, I'll tell you. What I can tell you now is that your instincts about your son are not the product of old age or confusion. They are the product of a man who has been paying attention. My phone buzzed on the arm of the chair. I nearly ignored it. Then something made me look the particular combination of an unfamiliar number and the subject line visible in the notification preview. RE Guardianship Petition, Decker Matter Whitfield and Associates Law. I opened it. The email was 3 paragraphs, legal language formatted and cold. It informed me that Prescott Allen Decker had filed a petition with the Black Hawk County District Court, seeking full legal guardianship of Stellan Decker, age 6. On the grounds that the current temporary guardian that was me demonstrated diminished physical and cognitive capacity, inconsistent with the demands of primary caregiving, as evidenced by documented incidents and corroborating witness accounts. A hearing had been scheduled for 6 weeks from the filing date. 6 weeks. I read the paragraph twice. Then I put the phone face down on my knee and sat very still. "He's taking Stellan," I said. My voice came out quieter than I intended. He filed a petition. "He's saying, I'm not that I can't." I stopped. My hands weren't steady. I noticed that and made myself put them flat on my thighs. Cordelia set her teacup down. She didn't rush to speak, didn't offer me the kind of hollow reassurance that makes a person feel more alone, not less. "Only if we let him," she said. It wasn't a platitude. The way she said it, deliberate, grounded. With the weight of a woman who has seen how these situations actually unfold, it sounded like a plan. Later that afternoon, she came over with a small cardboard box of equipment. 2 cameras for the front and back exterior, 1 for the living room, and a compact wide-angle unit for the kitchen. She walked me through the placement without making me feel like I didn't know my own house. When we got to the kitchen camera, she mounted it on the upper cabinet bracket I'd installed for Eleanor's old under-cabinet radio, angled slightly downward. Then she paused. Her eyes moved to the vitamin bottle sitting on the counter by the coffee maker where I had left it that morning. She adjusted the camera angle just slightly, maybe 10 degrees, until the frame covered the full length of the counter from the sink to the far wall. "Good coverage," she said mostly to herself, and moved on to the next room. I didn't think anything of it at the time. The walk back across the yard to my front door took about 30 seconds. I was almost to the porch steps when something made me glance toward the end of the street. A car I didn't recognize was parked under the last maple before the intersection. Dark-colored newer model windows tinted past the point where you could see anything inside. Cedar Falls is a quiet neighborhood. People here park in driveways, not on the street in the late afternoon, under trees where the light doesn't reach well. I stopped walking. The car didn't move. No engine running that I could hear. No one getting out, just sitting there positioned with a clean line of sight to my front door. Someone was in that car. I was certain of it. And whoever it was had been there long enough to choose that spot deliberately. I'd dropped Stellan off at Hoover Elementary at 7:52 and drove to the Cedar Falls Police Department on Clay Street without going home first. The drive took 11 minutes. I spent most of it rehearsing not the facts I had those straight, but the order, how to present it so it didn't sound like a confused old man cataloging grievances, how to make it land. The officer at the front desk was younger than my shoes. That's not fair, and I know it. He was probably 30, maybe 32, with the kind of patient neutrality they train into people who sit at intake desks all day. He typed while I talked. His eyes moved between me and the screen with the measured regularity of a metronome. I told him about Stellan's nighttime crying, about what my grandson had said, the language around special time, the threat about the judge, about the scratch on the back door lock, about the figure I'd seen on the street on multiple occasions, about the car with tinted windows parked at the end of the block. He typed. When I finished, he looked up. His expression hadn't changed. "Mr. Decker, without documented evidence of unlawful entry or a direct specific threat, there isn't much we can do at this stage. A person standing on a public street isn't a crime. A scratch on a door lock could have a number of explanations. And what your grandson told you," he paused carefully, "that's something you might want to bring to a family court advocate or a child psychologist. They're better equipped to evaluate that kind of disclosure." I looked at him for a moment. "You're right," I said. "Thank you for your time." He seemed mildly surprised that I didn't argue. The truth was I'd known what he was going to say before I parked the car. Some things you go through not because you expect a different result, but because you need to be able to say, you tried the official channel first. I drove home. Cordelia was already in my driveway. She had a cardboard box open on my porch steps and was reading the back of a camera package with the focused attention of someone who has done this before. She didn't look up when I pulled in. "They couldn't help," I said. "I know." She set the package down and picked up another. "That's why I went to the hardware store this morning." She'd bought 3 units of weatherproof outdoor camera for the front porch, a wide angle for the back exterior above the door, and a compact indoor unit she had already decided would go in the kitchen. That last one she handled separately from the others, setting it aside with a kind of deliberateness that I noticed but didn't comment on. My late husband was the county sheriff for 30 years. She said fitting the front camera onto its mounting bracket without looking at instructions. I know what evidence looks like. I also know what it looks like when someone is building a case rather than living a life. "Prescott," I said. "The petition." The language in it diminished capacity, documented incidents, corroborating witnesses. That's not Concern Harlan. That's a file being assembled. She handed me a screwdriver. "Hold this." We spent 2 hours installing. The exterior cameras she handled herself, climbing the stepladder with a steadiness that made me feel vaguely embarrassed about my own hesitation on the second rung. The kitchen unit she mounted on the bracket above the counter, the same position she'd used the day before, angled to cover the full length of the countertop from the coffee maker to the sink. She checked the feed on her phone, adjusted 2 degrees, checked again. "That covers the entry point and the counter," she said, satisfied. I looked at the vitamin bottle sitting next to the coffee maker, back in its usual spot where I'd put it that morning without thinking. The camera's field of view took in the whole counter. I didn't say anything about that. By mid-afternoon, the system was live feeding to both our phones and a small monitor I set up on the kitchen table. Stellan came home at 3:15 and wanted to know if we were making a spy movie. Cordelia told him we were making the house safer, which he accepted with the practical satisfaction of a 6-year-old who has been told a thing that makes sense. After dinner, after Stellan was in bed, I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea. I wasn't really drinking, and a small spiral notebook I'd found in Eleanor's old office drawer. I opened it to the first page and started writing. The symptoms I'd been attributing to grief, to age, to a hard year. The occasional difficulty tracking a conversation mid-sentence. The way certain words slipped sideways, sometimes just out of reach before returning. The morning 2 weeks ago, or was it 3 when I'd stood in the upstairs hallway and couldn't immediately remember why I'd come up? Small things. The kind of things every 71-year-old man notices and files under getting older. But I was a man who believed in writing things down, so I wrote them down. Dates where I could remember them. Approximate timelines. I got to February and stopped. February was when the court finalized Stellan's placement with me. February was also, I sat with this for a moment, when Prescott had first appeared at the door with that bottle, smiling. "Dad, you need to take care of yourself." The vitamins had become part of my routine so naturally that I'd stopped thinking of them as something he'd given me. They were just part of the morning, 2 capsules with coffee. Every day since February, 8 months. I set my pen down, looked at the bottle on the counter. I'm not a man who jumps to conclusions. I've spent 71 years watching people jump to conclusions and make fools of themselves, and I made a point long ago not to join them. What I had was a timeline overlap, a correlation, not evidence of anything, but I reached over and picked up the bottle, turned it in my hands. Premium label, professional, design, the kind of thing that costs $40 at a health food store and signals that someone spent real money to appear caring. I opened the cabinet drawer to the left of the sink, the one where Eleanor used to keep extra dish towels, and I put the bottle in it, closed the drawer. Not because I knew anything, because I wanted to pay attention to what happened next. I went to bed at 10. At some point before 11, I was nearly asleep. When my phone buzzed on the nightstand, the camera app motion detected back exterior. I sat up and opened the feed. The timestamp read 11:04 p.m. The rear camera showed the alley behind my house in pale gray night vision clarity. And there, moving along the fence line with a deliberateness that had nothing accidental about it, was a figure in dark clothing, not running, not hiding exactly. Moving in a pattern along the back fence, pause, scan. Continue along the side of the house, pause again, methodical. The route of someone who had walked it before and was confirming what they already knew. I watched until the figure moved out of frame at the west side of the property. Then I watched the front camera. 40 seconds later, the same figure appeared at the edge of the street view, pausing at the corner of the lot facing the house. Whoever this was, they weren't passing through. They were working. A week went by. Every night the camera picked up the figure, sometimes the back fence, sometimes the front walk just past the property line, standing at the edge of the streetlight's reach. Always between 10:30 and midnight. Always the same dark clothing. The same deliberate pace that I'd started to recognize the way you recognize a person's gait, not by their face, but by the particular rhythm of how they move through space. I'd watched the footage so many times, I could have described the route from memory. Along the back fence, east to west. Pause at the corner of the lot. Move to the front, just past the sycamore. Pause again. Face the house. Then withdraw slow and unhurried back into the dark between properties. Methodical, patient. Whoever it was, they weren't afraid of being seen. That was the thing that stayed with me through the daylight hours at the grocery store, dropping Stellan at school, eating breakfast across from Eleanor's empty chair. They weren't hiding. They were watching. The difference matters. Wednesday afternoon, I was in the kitchen cleaning up the lunch dishes when the knock came. Short, even deliberate, the knock of someone who expects the door to open. Cordelia stood on the porch. She was wearing her gray wool coat, the one I'd started to think of as her official version of herself. In her right hand, she held a white envelope, letter size sealed, no name on the front. She held it out to me. I took it. "What is tonight?" she said, and turned. "Cordelia." I stepped out onto the porch. "At least tell me..." She paused at the bottom of the steps without looking back. "Tonight you'll understand, Harlan." Then she walked across the yard to her front door, went inside, and that was that. I stood on my porch for a moment, holding the envelope. It had some weight to it, not the weight of multiple pages, but the density of cardstock, something deliberate. I went inside and set it on the kitchen table, and didn't open it for 20 minutes. Not for any particular reason. I just wanted to sit with it first. Eleanor used to say I approached everything that mattered to me slowly, like a man who didn't trust that good things would hold still. She wasn't wrong about that. When I opened it, I found a single sheet of cream-colored paper, folded in thirds. Cordelia's handwriting, small, angular, the cursive of a woman who learned penmanship before anyone questioned whether it was worth learning. "Tonight, turn off the living room lights. Stand behind the front curtain at 11 p.m. Put Stellan to bed before 9. Do not go outside, regardless of what you see. Do not turn on any lights after 10 p.m. Wait. No signature. Just those 5 sentences and a small line at the bottom. Trust the process, not the impulse." I read it 3 times. Then I folded it back along its original creases and slipped it into the inside pocket of my cardigan. The one with the button that Eleanor had re-sewn twice because the thread kept pulling through the fabric. I don't know why that pocket felt like the right place for it. It just did. Stellan wanted grilled cheese for dinner. So that's what we had, 2 sandwiches on sourdough, cut diagonally, because he'd decided at some point that diagonals tasted better than squares, and I had never found a compelling argument against the theory. We ate at the kitchen table with the small lamp on, and the evening news turned low in the background, and I let him talk about his day with the full attention that children require when they've stored up something and finally have an audience for it. His teacher had apparently said his drawing of a horse looked more like a table with hair which he found deeply unjust. I told him Eleanor used to say the same thing about my attempts at drawing dogs, and he laughed. And for a little while, the house felt like a house again. By 8:30, he was yawning. I took him up, sat on the edge of his bed, and told him 2 chapters of the book we'd been working through. A story about a lighthouse keeper and a boy who collected unusual rocks. He was asleep before the 2nd chapter ended, Captain the teddy bear wedged under one arm, his breathing slow and settled. I sat there a little longer than I needed to. Sometimes I do that. I sit in his room and watch him sleep the way I used to watch the fields behind my father's house when I was young, not looking for anything, just needing to know that something in the world was still peacefully itself. I went back downstairs at 9:15. The next 45 minutes I spent in the kitchen reading nothing, holding a cup of tea I'd made out of habit. At 10 o'clock, I turned off the kitchen light, then the hallway, then the living room. The house went dark. I stood still for a moment while my eyes adjusted, Cedar Falls is quiet enough that the dark is actual dark, not the sodium orange half dark of larger cities. Then I moved to the front window and positioned myself behind the curtain. The fabric was heavy linen, the kind that blocks light coming in, but lets you see out if you're close enough. I stood with one hand on the curtain's edge and looked out at Maple Grove. The street was empty. The sycamore at the end of the lot stood in its pool of indirect light from the intersection lamp a half block away. A neighbor's porch light 3 houses down. The faint glint of a car windshield somewhere past the property line. Nothing moved. I'm not sure how long I stood there before my mind started to go sideways. That's what happens when you put a 71-year-old man alone in a dark room with nothing to do but wait. The thoughts come in on their own schedule. I thought about Eleanor. The last winter when she'd started waking up before 4 and sitting at the kitchen table with the lights off, and when I'd come down to find her, she'd say she was just thinking. I never asked what about. I wish now that I had asked. You always wish that afterward. Then I thought about Stellan upstairs, the weight of him asleep in that house. The particular responsibility of being the thing standing between a 6-year-old and whatever was organizing itself in the dark outside my window. There was no version of this situation where I walked away. He was Eleanor's grandson. He was mine. Whatever was coming at us, it was going to have to come through me first. The clock on the mantel read 10:58, 11 o'clock. At the far end of Maple Grove, where the street bent slightly before the intersection, something shifted. A separation of darkness from darkness. A shape that hadn't been there a moment ago, stepping out from the space between 2 parked cars. Moving, coming this way, slow, deliberate, toward my house. He stepped into the streetlight and I stopped breathing. Not from fear, or not only from fear. It was the specific shock of something you've been watching in fragments finally resolving into a whole. For a week I'd seen shapes and shadows movement at the edge of camera range, the outline of a figure I couldn't place. And now, here he was, a man mid to late 50s, heavy set through the shoulders. Wearing a dark canvas jacket and moving with the kind of deliberate, unhurried pace that belongs to people who are completely certain of what they're doing. He walked along the front edge of my property without slowing. His head moved as he went, not the darting look of someone trying not to be seen, but the methodical scan of someone running a checklist. He checked the front window latches. He checked the gap between the porch railing and the siding. He stopped at the corner of the house and looked up, not at me, not at the living room window, but at the second floor, at the window of Stellan's room. He looked at it for a long moment. Then he moved on along the side of the house toward the back. I had been watching people my whole life, 71 years of reading rooms and faces and the particular language of how people carry themselves when they think no one is paying attention. And I knew watching this man move along the perimeter of my home at 11 o'clock at night that he was not looking for a way in. He was checking that no one else had gotten there first. There's a difference. It's subtle, but it's real. An intruder circles a house looking for weakness. A guard circles a house looking for intrusion. The body language is almost opposite if you know what to look for, and I had been watching his footage long enough that I knew. He wasn't testing my defenses. He was confirming them. I heard the soft sound of the back door. I left it on the latch, which I had done without quite deciding to. Some instinct from reading Cordelia's note that said, "Trust the process," and made me think she might need a way in. Quiet footsteps in the kitchen. Then a shape appeared in the hallway entrance to the living room, and I nearly put my elbow through the curtain. "It's me," Cordelia said barely above a whisper. She crossed to the window in the dark, moving without hesitation the way people move, in spaces they have already mapped, and stood beside me. Close enough that I could hear her breathing steady out as she took in the scene outside. "You know him," I said. It wasn't a question. "I know what he's doing," she said. "He's been doing it since April." I turned to look at her profile in the faint ambient light from the street. "Since April, and you didn't tell me." I needed to understand why first. She kept her eyes on the yard. "I do now." We stood in silence while the figure, this man I didn't know, completed his circuit and reappeared at the front of the property. He moved to the gatepost and checked the hinge, ran a hand along the top, rail paused. Then he stepped back to the edge of the sidewalk under the nearest pool of streetlight and stood. And then he looked up, not at the house generally, at the window, at the specific rectangle of glass behind which 2 people were standing in the dark trying not to move. He held the look for 3 seconds. Then he gave a single small nod, the nod of a man acknowledging something not performing for anyone, and walked back toward the far end of the street and was gone. I exhaled. He knew we were here, I said. He knew I would be here, Cordelia said. He left the nod for you. I turned to her. In the dark, I could see the shape of her expression, not quite calm, not quite troubled. Something in between the look of a woman who has been carrying a piece of information for longer than was comfortable and is now deciding how much to put down. Sit down, Harlan, she said. We moved to the 2 chairs by the fireplace. I didn't turn the lights on. It didn't seem right to somehow, like whatever she was about to say belonged to the dark. I was a family court judge for 22 years, she said. I didn't say anything. I thought about the courthouse photograph on her wall, shot from a distance observing, rather than celebrating. I thought about the bookshelves, the case study volumes, the way she'd looked at the email from Prescott's lawyer with the immediate precise attention of someone who reads that kind of language every day. 11 years ago, she continued, a woman came before my bench. She had been financially defrauded. Her life savings, just under $40,000, moved through a series of small business transactions over 18 months until there was nothing left. A pause. The man who did it was named Prescott Decker. The name landed in the room like a stone dropped in still water. He walked, I said. Insufficient evidence. The transactions were structured to look like voluntary investments. She had signed documents she didn't fully understand what she was signing, but she'd signed them. Cordelia's voice was even, but underneath it I heard something that had been waiting 11 years for a proper place to land. He walked and I sat on that bench and watched him walk, and I have not forgotten his name since. So when you moved here, when I saw the address and the name on the county property record, she looked at me steadily. I packed my boxes that same weekend, Harlan. I sat with that for a long moment. The shape of what she'd done, the deliberateness of it, the patience was almost more than I could organize into a single thought. The man outside, I said finally. Who is he? His name is Cormac Ellery, she said. And I think you need to ask him that question yourself. The room was quiet. Outside, Maple Grove had gone back to its ordinary nighttime stillness, the sycamore, the streetlight, the dark between houses. No movement, no figure on the sidewalk. I need to talk to him, I said. Cordelia nodded once. Yes, she said. You do. Before I tell you what Cormac said when I finally sat across from him, drop a comment with the number 10 so I know you're still with me. Every single one of you matters more than you know. A small note, the story ahead, contains some fictional elements shaped for reflection. If that's not for you, it's okay to step away and find something that fits better. No hard feelings. I made Stellan's oatmeal before I put on my jacket. Brown sugar on top the way he likes it, with 3 apple slices cut thin on the side. I set it on the table, poured his orange juice, and called up the stairs that breakfast was ready. Then I went next door and knocked on Cordelia's door at 7:45 in the morning and asked her without preamble if she would sit with Stellan for 20 minutes. She looked at me. Looked past me toward the end of the street where the dark-colored car was parked in its usual spot under the last maple before the intersection. Take as long as you need, she said, and reached for her cardigan on the hook by the door. I walked down Maple Grove in the thin October morning. The sycamore was dropping its last leaves in slow, unhurried spirals, landing on the wet pavement, with the small sound that autumn makes when it's finishing something. My breath came out visible in the cold air. I didn't walk fast. I wasn't trying to catch anyone off guard. That wasn't the point. The point was to cover the distance and do the thing I'd decided to do. The car was a dark gray Ford, a few years old, clean but not polished, Iowa plates. As I got close enough to see through the windshield, I could make out the shape of a man sitting in the driver's seat, both hands visible on the wheel, watching me approach in the side mirror. He didn't start the engine. I came around to the driver's side and knocked on the glass with 2 knuckles. The window came down. Up close, Cormac Ellery was about what the footage had suggested. Late 50s built solidly, a face that had weathered enough years that it had settled into something permanent and hard to read. Dark eyes that looked at me without blinking, without performing anything. Not hostile, not warm. Simply present the way a man is present when he's been expecting a moment and has had time to prepare for it. You're Harlan Decker, he said, You know who I am? I do. He held my gaze. My name is Cormac Ellery, and I think we should talk somewhere private, Mr. Decker. He glanced toward my house, toward the window, where Cordelia's silhouette was just visible watching. Somewhere that isn't here. We walked to Java Brewing on Main Street, which was 4 blocks and took 8 minutes, and passed in almost complete silence. Not the silence of two men who have nothing to say, but the silence of two men who have decided without discussing it, that whatever needed to be said should wait for a table and a door between them and the street. The morning crowd was like 2 students at the bar with laptops, a woman in scrubs waiting for a to-go order, the low familiar smell of ground coffee and something baking in the back. The barista called out a name I didn't catch. I found the corner table by the far window, and we sat down, and when the server came, I ordered 2 coffees because it gave my hands something to do. Cormac Ellery sat across from me, with both hands flat on the table. It was a deliberate posture. I recognized it as such. The body language of a man who understands that the first thing he needs to do is not appear threatening. He'd thought about how this conversation would go. He'd thought about it before I knocked on his window. "Start talking," I said. "I've been watching your house since April," he said. "Straight opening, no softening. 3 nights a week, sometimes 4. Your back perimeter, your front approach, the side gate. I've been following Prescott Decker's movements when he comes to Cedar Falls. I know the car he drives, and the route he takes, and how long he usually stays." He paused. "I also know about the guardianship petition, and the lawyer he hired." I watched his face. Nothing I could see suggested rehearsed deception. Nothing suggested improvisation either. This was a man repeating things he'd known for a long time, patiently waiting for the right moment to say them. "Why?" I said. He looked down at his coffee for a moment. When he looked back up, something had shifted in his expression, not quite to softness, but to something more careful, like a man deciding to set down something heavy. "I knew Eleanor," he said. 3 words. I don't know how to explain what those 3 words did to the inside of my chest. It wasn't shock, not exactly. Eleanor had a life that extended beyond what I could see of it. She had friends and histories and a whole set of relationships that predated me, and I'd always known that. It wasn't even that the name surprised me coming from his mouth. It was the way he said it. Knew Eleanor, not knew your wife, not I was acquainted with Eleanor Decker. Just her name said, with the quiet weight of a person who means it fully. The way people only speak the names of the dead when the dead actually mattered to them. In the 11 months since Eleanor had passed, a lot of people had said her name. The hospice nurses, her sister calling, from Portland, the probate attorney, the neighbors who brought casseroles in January. They had all said her name correctly and kindly and completely without the specific gravity that Cormac Ellery packed into those 2 syllables in a coffee shop on a Thursday morning. For a moment I couldn't speak. The coffee sat in front of me steaming. The students at the bar were laughing about something. The October light came through the window at the angle that meant it was just past 8. "How?" I said. My voice came out lower than usual. "How did you know my wife?" Cormac looked down at his cup again, both hands around it, not drinking. The pause was long enough that I started to wonder if he was deciding whether to tell me at all. Then he raised his eyes. "She asked me to protect you," he said, "before she died. She asked me to make sure you and Stellan would be safe." His jaw moved slightly, the controlled expression of a man keeping something in check. "She knew something was coming, Mr. Decker. She told me she'd seen the signs, and she was afraid she wasn't going to have enough time to stop it herself." The corner table of Java Brewing on Main Street, Cedar Falls, Iowa. 8:03 in the morning. I sat there with the weight of that landing on me like a second winter. I didn't speak for a long time. Outside the window, a maple leaf came loose from the sycamore across the street and turned over twice before it reached the pavement. Eleanor used to say that autumn was the season of truth, that something about the light in October made it harder for things to hide. Standing on the other side of her death, sitting in a coffee shop I'd never been to before, I was starting to understand what she meant by that. "Tell me everything," I said. My voice surprised me. I'd expected it to come out harder, angrier, the voice of a man who has spent a week watching shadows outside his windows and 2 hours not knowing who was making them. But there was no anger left in it, just the particular exhaustion of someone who has been carrying questions too heavy to set down and is finally willing to let someone else help him understand them. Cormac looked at me for a moment. Then he nodded once and began. He'd met Eleanor 3 years ago through the Cedar Valley United Way, the volunteer coordination group that ran food distribution and senior support services across the county. She'd organized the Thursday morning delivery route for the east side of Cedar Falls. He'd signed on as a driver after retiring from 20 years in private security. They had spent a lot of Thursday mornings in the cab of a cargo van, talking the way people do when they're side by side rather than face to face. And the task in front of them makes honesty easier. I looked at his hands while he talked. Wide across the knuckles, weathered the kind of hands that belonged to someone who'd spent years working outdoors, or in conditions that didn't allow for comfort. Not dangerous-looking hands. Practical ones. The kind of hands you'd trust to carry something fragile without being told to be careful. I wondered where Eleanor had sat in that van. Whether she'd looked out the passenger window when she talked, or whether she'd looked at him. Whether she'd told him things she hadn't told me. She talked about Prescott, Cormac said. Not right away, over months. Small things first comments, she brushed off situations she described without quite saying what was wrong with them. She was careful. She didn't want to say it outright until she was certain. He paused. She wasn't certain until 3 weeks before she died. I kept my hands flat on the table. She'd found something, he said. Documents, she called them. She didn't tell me what they were specifically. She said she'd put it all on a drive and she'd be in touch. That was on a Thursday. The following week, she was in the hospital. He set his coffee cup down quietly. I visited her twice before she passed. The second time she gave me the drive. She told me the password was something only you would know. And she told me not to give it to you until Prescott had done something you could see with your own eyes. Something that couldn't be explained away. The petition, I said. That's what I figured, yes. I thought about Eleanor in a hospital bed, handing a USB drive to a man she'd known through Thursday morning van routes and the particular honesty of side-by-side conversations. Making plans for a future she knew she wasn't going to be in. Deciding what Harlan Decker would need and when and from whom. Because she knew her husband well enough to know that giving him the information too early would be the same as pulling the pin before he was in the right position. She didn't tell me, I said. It came out flat, not accusatory, just the plain fact of it settling in my chest. She knew you, Cormac said. She said, and this is what she told me. In her words, she said, Harlan will go straight to Prescott the moment he knows. That's who he is, and I love him for it. But this time, going at Prescott directly will get him killed. The coffee shop hum continued around us. The espresso machine ran a cycle. Someone's phone rang twice and went to voicemail. The ordinary texture of a Thursday morning in Cedar Falls, Iowa, running on top of the most devastating thing anyone had said to me in 11 months. She'd known. Eleanor had spent her last weeks watching Prescott's pattern take shape, documenting what she could. Making arrangements with a quiet efficiency that I would have recognized immediately as her particular way of loving people, taking care of things before they became catastrophes. Without announcement, without asking for credit. She'd done it our whole marriage. I just hadn't known that last winter that she was doing it one final time. She was protecting me, I said. Right up to the end. Cormac looked at me steadily. That's what she was doing. I sat with that. It had a different weight than grief, not heavier, not lighter, but differently shaped. Like something you'd been carrying at the wrong angle, and someone had just shifted the load, and suddenly you could feel where it had been pressing on you all along. Cormac reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and set something on the table between us. A USB drive. Small, black, unremarkable, the kind that comes in a 3-pack from a pharmacy checkout display. A small piece of white tape on the side, with 3 letters written in Eleanor's handwriting, HD. I looked at it for a long moment without picking it up. I don't know what's on it, Cormac said. She didn't tell me, and I didn't try to find out. It was hers to give and yours to open. I reached out and picked it up, held it in my palm. It weighed almost nothing, which seemed wrong for something that contained whatever Eleanor had needed to say badly enough to arrange it from a hospital bed. She knew all of it, I said. Not a question. She knew what was coming, and she didn't tell me. Cormac nodded. I felt my throat tighten in a way that I refused to give ground to. Not here, not in a coffee shop on Main Street on a Thursday morning. I closed my fingers around the drive and put it in the inside breast pocket of my jacket, the left side over my chest, next to the folded paper, with Cordelia's handwritten instructions that I'd forgotten to take out. Eleanor had put me in reach of the truth. She'd just known me well enough to understand that I needed the right moment to be ready to hold it. "There's one more thing you need to know," Cormac said. His voice had changed again. Not softer, but more deliberate, the way a man speaks when he's getting to the thing that has cost him the most to know. I looked at him across the table. "About why Prescott hates you the way he does." I didn't move. Outside, another leaf came down. I thought about Eleanor and Autumn and the season of truth. "Tell me," I said. I signaled the server for another coffee. I didn't want it. My stomach had stopped accepting coffee somewhere around the middle of the last hour, and I knew it. But I needed the 2 minutes of the server coming over the cup being set down. The small domestic pause of sugar and spoon. I needed the space that ordinary actions create when the things being said are not ordinary at all. The coffee shop had filled up since we'd sat down. A table of 4 near the door, college-age laughing about something on someone's phone. 2 women in business clothes by the window, working through a stack of papers. The espresso machine ran almost continuously now, and the smell of fresh grounds and baked pastry moved through the room in warm waves that had nothing to do with how cold the air had gone inside my chest. Cormac glanced around once, a quick, practiced sweep. The kind of check that has become automatic in a person who has spent years in security work and then looked back at me. At 4 years ago, he said, "You reported Prescott to the police. Domestic violence against Lavinia." "I know what I did," I said. "I know you do. I'm not telling you what happened. I'm telling you what it meant to him." He folded his hands on the table. Outside, the morning traffic on Main Street moved in its ordinary Cedar Falls rhythm. A pickup waiting at the light, a woman with a stroller crossing at the corner. The small city cadence of a place where people generally know each other's business. Eleanor spent the last months of her life doing what she'd always done quietly, Cormac said. Paying attention, making notes, following things to their source. She visited Lavinia in November, 2 months before she passed. Lavinia told her things she hadn't told anyone else. About why she'd withdrawn the complaint. I remembered that. The way the whole thing had simply dissolved, the police visit, the report, Lavinia's statement. All of it unraveling inside 2 weeks, until there was nothing left but Prescott looking at me across a courthouse lobby with those eyes. "She was threatened," I said. "There was a phone call," Cormac said. "Prescott called Lavinia 3 days after you filed the report. He told her what would happen to her if the complaint went forward. He was specific." A pause. "She recorded it. She'd started recording his calls after the first time he heard her. She had 3 months of recordings on her phone. She never used them. She was 29 years old, and she was terrified of him. She'd grown up in a household where the person with authority was the person with the loudest voice, and Prescott had spent 4 years teaching her that his voice was the loudest one she'd ever hear." Cormac's tone didn't shift toward judgment. He said it the way someone says a fact they've had time to accept. Eleanor listened to the recordings, all of them. She asked Lavinia if she could copy the one from the week you filed the report. Lavinia agreed. She didn't say no. Eleanor took that as yes. Something that might have been the beginning of a smile crossed Cormac's face and didn't stay. "That's in the USB Harlan, among other things." Now that I thought about Eleanor in Lavinia's apartment in November, sitting across from a woman 20 years younger than her, listening to recordings of her son's voice, copying evidence onto a thumb drive with the focused calm of someone who has made their peace with what they're doing. My wife, who had told me every night for 40 years that she was going to read for a while before sleeping, and who had spent those last autumn months building a case against our son in the dark while I lay upstairs not knowing. "Prescott knew it was me who called," I said. "He's always known. He told Lavinia the day after the report was filed. He said his father had made the call and that he would take care of it, and that she should understand what that meant about where this family's loyalties were." I sat with that sentence for a moment. "He's been planning this for 4 years, I said, not a question. "The vitamins were step 1, Cormac said. "He started bringing them in February right after the court placed Stellan with you. He needed you to appear mentally diminished in time for the guardianship hearing. He needed 6 to 8 months of a slow, consistent compound to show measurable cognitive changes on a medical assessment. He paused. The petition was step 2. He filed it at the 8-month mark because he calculated that would be enough time. The words arrived in the order Cormac said them and took their time settling. I understood each one individually. The way they assembled together into a single coherent picture was harder to move through. My son had sat across from me at this house's kitchen table and handed me a bottle with both hands and said, "Eleanor would have wanted this." And the thing inside that bottle was designed to take away the part of my mind that could fight back. He knew exactly how long it would take, I said. He researched it. Eleanor found his search history on a family laptop he'd used during a visit. She didn't know what she was looking at, initially just medical and pharmaceutical terms she didn't recognize. She screenshotted them and sent them to a friend from her volunteer group who had a medical background. When she found out what they meant, that's when she contacted me. I looked down at my coffee. It had gone lukewarm. "I was only trying to protect Lavinia," I said. The words came out with the full weight of 4 years of consequence attached to them. That's all I was doing, and instead, I handed him a reason to spend 4 years planning how to take everything from me. Cormac shook his head slowly and without any hesitation. No, he would have found a reason regardless. That's who he is, a man who builds grievances into architecture. You just happened to give him a foundation to build on earlier than he had planned. It didn't make me feel better, but it was the most honest thing anyone had said to me in a long time, and I held on to it for that reason. He reached into his jacket and placed a small folded piece of paper on the table. Handwritten number, 7 digits Iowa area code. "There's one more person you need to talk to," he said. "Eleanor left her contact information in the USB, but I have it here too in case you weren't ready to open the drive yet." He looked at me steadily. "Her name is Lavinia." I picked up the paper. The handwriting was Cormac's blocky, unhurried. I looked at the number and thought about Lavinia as I'd last seen her 2 years ago at a family dinner Prescott had organized, sitting at the far end of the table, talking very little, refilling her water glass every few minutes the way anxious people do when they need something to do with their hands. "She's been trying to reach you for months," Cormac said. "She found ways around the direct route. She's been careful, but not careful enough to feel safe." I looked up. "What do you mean, not safe?" Cormac's expression didn't change. He looked at me the way people look at you when they're about to tell you that something you thought was only complicated is actually dangerous. "Prescott has been watching her," he said. "He knows she has information he can't afford to have surfaced. And Lavinia has someone in her life that Prescott knows she can't afford to lose." He stopped there. I stared at him. "What does that mean?" He didn't answer the question directly. He just held my gaze, letting the shape of what he'd said land in the space between us. "Talk to Lavinia," he said. "She'll explain the rest." I called the number 3 times before she picked up. The first call went to voicemail. A generic recording, no name, just the number, read back in a computerized voice. The second call, I let ring 8 times and hung up. The third time she answered on the second ring, like she'd been sitting next to the phone, working up to it. Her voice sounded like someone who hadn't slept properly in weeks. Not groggy, the opposite of groggy. The tight, hyper-alert sound of a person who has been waking at small noises and lying rigid in the dark and calling it rest. "Mr. Decker," she said. She'd known it was me before I identified myself. We arranged to meet at her house that same afternoon. She gave me the address without hesitation, which told me she'd already decided before I called that she would tell me everything if I ever asked. Lavinia was renting a small craftsman house in a quiet section of Waterloo, close enough to Cedar Falls that Stellan could reach her far enough that Prescott didn't pass it on his regular routes. I parked on the street and walked up a front path, edged with dead marigolds that no one had cut back yet. She opened the door before I reached the porch. She looked older than I remembered, not aged exactly, compressed the way grief and sustained fear compress a person, pulling the energy inward until the surface looked still. Her eyes were red at the rims. She looked at me, standing on her porch on a Friday afternoon in October, and she didn't ask what had taken me so long, didn't express surprise, didn't perform any of the social mechanics that people use to manage an awkward moment. She just opened the door wider. "I've been waiting for you, Dad," she said. I hadn't been called that in over a year, not since the last time Eleanor was alive, and the family had still been something that could occupy the same room without the air going brittle. I went inside. The living room was neat but provisional, the neatness of someone packing rather than settling. 3 cardboard boxes stacked against the far wall, sealed with brown tape labeled in marker. The curtains were drawn fully closed, even though it was mid-afternoon, the kind of indirect daylight that makes a room feel like it's in a different time zone. Her phone sat face down on the coffee table. The walls were completely bare, no photos, no prints, no evidence of a life being displayed, just paint and the rectangular shadows where frames had recently been removed. I sat down on the sofa. She sat across from me, both hands in her lap, and I waited. "I didn't know where to start," she said. That was part of the problem. I knew so much by the time I was ready to say anything that the whole shape of it was too large to hand to someone all at once. She looked at her hands. So I tried letters. "Tell me about the letters," I said. She'd written the first one in late September, 3 weeks after Cordelia moved in next door to me. Cordelia had reached out to her first through a channel they'd maintained quietly for 4 years, a post office box in Iowa City that Prescott had no knowledge of, opened under a name variation that wasn't quite an alias, but wasn't quite hers either. Cordelia had sent a single postcard. "I'm in Cedar Falls now. It's time." I knew Cordelia from when I finally filed the protection order, Lavinia said. She was the judge who signed it. After the case fell apart and I withdrew my statement, she reached out through her court advocate's office, just a resource list technically, but her personal number was written in the margin. A small pause. I understood what that meant. "She's been your contact this whole time," I said. "She's been the only one I trusted completely, because she was the only one who had no connection to Prescott that he could leverage." Lavinia looked up at me. "I sent 3 letters through her. She passed them to your mailbox directly, no postmark, no return address. I assumed you'd read them. I sat very still, letters in the mailbox, envelopes with no return address that I'd set aside in the kitchen drawer, under the assumption that they were solicitations. Because Eleanor had always handled the mail, and I'd never developed the habit of reading things carefully before deciding they weren't worth reading. "I have them," I said. "I haven't opened them." Something moved across Lavinia's face that wasn't quite relief and wasn't quite disappointment, just the expression of a person recalibrating. "Then let me tell you what's in them," she said. She told me about the silence agreement first, the document Prescott had placed in front of her 6 months into their separation, with a family lawyer present who she later understood was on Prescott's payroll. The agreement prohibited her from discussing Prescott's personal conduct, financial activities, or family relationships with any third party. Violation meant immediate suspension of her supervised visitation rights with Stellan, effective within 48 hours of a complaint filing. The legal mechanism was already built. The paperwork was already drafted. She would have signed herself out of Stellan's life with a phone call to a lawyer she'd never met. "I signed it," she said. "I know how that sounds. You were protecting your time with him," I said. She looked at me for a moment like she was deciding whether to believe that I meant it. Then she nodded. "The second thing," she said, "Prescott went to Dubuque. He drove there himself. He met my mother at her house. He brought her flowers, which is the kind of thing Prescott does, because he understands that the gesture makes the threat land harder. He told her that if I communicated with you or anyone in your household in any traceable way, he would resurface a property dispute from 15 years ago involving her home. It doesn't matter whether the legal threat was real. She's 73 years old, and she called me afterward, and she was shaking." Lavinia's voice held steady through this, but only barely. "I couldn't do that to her. I couldn't." "You couldn't?" I agreed. She stood up, went to the small writing desk by the covered window and opened the bottom drawer. Came back with a manila envelope, legal-sized its clasp, bent from repeated opening and closing. She set it on the coffee table between us. 2 years of documentation, she said. Bank statements I photographed. Text messages I screenshotted before he made me change phones. Emails from the lawyer, he uses 3 of them sent to Prescott's personal account that I copied when he left his laptop open. And the original recording. She looked at me evenly. The phone call from 4 years ago, when he told me exactly what would happen if the complaint moved forward. I looked at the envelope. "Lavinia," I said, "you've been holding this for 2 years. I've been building it for 2 years," she said. "There's a difference." She sat back down. "I wasn't just surviving Mr. Decker. I was waiting until there was enough to make sure he couldn't walk away from it this time." I thought about Eleanor in November, sitting in this same kind of chair across from this woman, listening to recordings of their son's voice in the dark. Two women who had decided, without coordinating with each other, to do the same necessary thing in parallel. "I love Stellan," Lavinia said quietly. "I know I didn't carry him. I know what the legal documents say about my relationship to him. But that boy is my son. He has been since the week I met him. And Prescott using him as a mechanism, as a lever to pull," she stopped, reset. "I won't let that stand." "Neither will I said. We sat for a moment in the quiet of her curtained-off room. "There's one more thing," she said. Her voice changed, not louder, not softer, but with the particular shift in register that happens when someone is approaching the part they have been rehearsing. "About Eleanor's will." I went still. "What about it?" She stood up without answering, walked to the door of the back room. I heard a drawer open. Then a pause the length of a person taking a breath and deciding to go through with something. She came back holding a second envelope thicker than the first. The paper softened at the edges from age and handling. "Prescott showed me a copy of Eleanor's will 2 years ago," she said. "She held it carefully the way you hold something that has already done damage. He was very pleased with himself, more pleased than I'd ever seen him." She set it on the table in front of me and didn't let go of it immediately. But the more I thought about what was in it, and the more I understood about who Eleanor was, I think what he showed me and what Eleanor actually wrote are two very different things. The envelope sat between us on the coffee table. I looked at it. I stared at the envelope on the coffee table. Lavinia didn't sit back down. She moved to the window and stood with her back to the room, looking out through the gap at the edge of the drawn curtain, at the dead marigolds and the empty street, like she had already lived through this moment and didn't need to watch it again. I opened the envelope. 2 documents inside. I laid them side by side on the table. The first one I recognized. I had seen it, or something identical to it, in the office of a probate attorney in January, 6 days after Eleanor's funeral, when I had sat across from a man in a gray suit and tried to track what he was saying through the particular numbness that had moved in and set up residence somewhere between my ears. The layout, the font, the way the paragraphs were structured, familiar. The second document was different. Same paperweight, same general format. But the notary seal in the lower right corner came from a different office. The signature block used a different attorney. And the date at the top was 3 months earlier than the first. Eleanor had signed both. Her handwriting was unmistakable to me, the slight leftward lean she had developed in her 20s and never corrected. The way her capital H had a small loop that shouldn't have been there by the rules, but was always there anyway. Both signatures were hers, but they were not the same document. I read the second one slowly. The assets were straightforward, the house on Maple Grove, the savings, the small investment account she had maintained quietly for 15 years. All of it to me in full, which was not different from what the first document said. But there was a section in the second document that was not in the first. A single paragraph formatted as a specific exclusion clause. Prescott Allen Decker is expressly and irrevocably excluded from guardianship of Stellan Decker under any circumstance, and from any fiduciary role pertaining to Stellan Decker's care assets, or legal standing. This exclusion is made with full legal awareness and for reasons known to the undersigned. I read that paragraph twice. Then I put the document down on the table and covered my face with my hands. I'm 71 years old, and I have spent most of that time under the working assumption that a man who needs to compose himself should do so privately, or at least quietly. But there is a particular kind of grief that doesn't ask your permission before it arrives, and sitting in Lavinia's curtained living room on a Friday afternoon in October, reading the last deliberate act of my wife's intelligence and love written out in her slightly irregular H's, I did not have the resources to manage it neatly. Eleanor had known. She had sat somewhere in the last months of her life, sick, exhausted, watching Prescott from a distance and understanding exactly what he was. And she had found a different attorney, in a different office in a different county, and she had written the truth of what she knew into a document that was supposed to protect Stellan and me after she was gone. And then that document had been replaced by something that didn't contain any of it. I felt Lavinia's hand come to rest on my shoulder. She didn't say anything. She just stood there, which was the right thing to do. After a minute, I took my hands away from my face and picked up both documents and stood up. "I need Cordelia to look at these," I said. Lavinia nodded. "I know." We drove separately. Cordelia opened her front door while I was still crossing the yard, which had become a pattern I'd stopped being surprised by. She looked at my face, then at the documents in my hand, and stepped aside without comment. Her home office was at the back of the house, a room I hadn't been in before. Bookshelves on 3 walls, a wide desk with good light, a magnifying glass, and a set of reading glasses on a stand beside the lamp. The desk of a person who reads documents professionally and has never stopped thinking of herself that way. She laid both pages flat under the desk lamp and studied them for a long time without speaking. I stood on one side of the desk. Lavinia stood on the other. The room was very quiet. The notary seal on the version you received at probate, Cordelia said finally, belongs to an office that closed 18 months ago. The ink dating is inconsistent. The signature block shows chemical composition that postdates the printed date by approximately 4 to 6 months. She straightened up and looked at me directly. "This is a forgery, Harlan. A careful one. Whoever made it understood the process well enough to replicate most of the correct elements, but not well enough to account for the notary's operational history." I thought about Prescott, calm, methodical Prescott, researching notary offices, finding one that had closed, building something that would pass a standard review, but not a forensic one. "Eleanor sent the real will to a separate attorney," Lavinia said. "She told me in November. She said she'd had it drawn up by someone Prescott had never met and never would, and that the original was filed with the court in Johnson County. She said she didn't tell you, because she was afraid Prescott was monitoring your mail, and she didn't want to risk a paper trail before she could ensure it was protected." "He intercepted the probate process," Cordelia said. "It would have required someone on the inside, a contact in the attorney's office, or access to the estate correspondence before it reached you. Not impossible for someone who spent months planning." She picked up the authenticated document and held it carefully. "The original filing in Johnson County will still exist. Court records of this kind cannot simply be removed. Detective Garrison will be able to pull it through proper channels." I registered the name Garrison Whitmore, the detective Cordelia had mentioned once before, briefly in a context I hadn't fully processed until now. I filed it and moved on. "What do we have now?" I said, not a question exactly, taking inventory. "The authenticated will, Lavinia's documented evidence, the recordings, the financial records, the correspondence, the security camera footage." Cordelia set the document down and looked at me. "But to arrest him, Garrison will need the kitchen footage, specifically footage of Prescott handling the vitamin bottles, showing him substituting them or introducing the supplement with clear timestamp evidence." She paused. "The camera angle on your counter will cover it." I thought about Cordelia's hands adjusting that bracket. 10 degrees. The field of view taking in the full length of the counter from the sink to the far wall. I had not thought anything of it at the time. I thought something of it now. My phone was face down on the corner of Cordelia's desk, where I had set it when we spread the documents out. The screen lit up. I could see from the angle that it had lit up more than once in the past 20 minutes. Cordelia noticed before I did. She looked at the screen, and her expression shifted slightly, a fractional tightening around the eyes that, on her face, constituted urgency. "Harlan," she said, "that's Unity Point Medical. They've been trying to reach you since this morning." She looked up at me. "They say it's urgent." I looked at Cordelia. I looked at Lavinia. I looked at my phone on the corner of the desk, lit up with a missed call notification from a number I recognized as the clinic, where I'd had my blood work done 3 weeks ago. The vitamin bottle. The notebook in the kitchen drawer with its careful list of dates. The morning I'd stood in the upstairs hallway and lost the thread of why I'd gone up there. Prescott's voice smooth and solicitous. "Are you taking the vitamins I brought Dad? Eleanor would have wanted you to take care of yourself. Everything that had been moving toward a shape finally completed one. I picked up the phone. The clinic smelled the way all clinics smell: antiseptic and recycled air, and the particular stillness of a place where bad news arrives regularly enough that the walls have learned to absorb it. I had called back from the parking lot outside Cordelia's house, still holding the 2 wills. The nurse who answered didn't hedge. She said, "Please come in today if at all possible." And the way she said it, "Not when you have a chance. Not at your earliest convenience," told me everything I needed to know about the category of news that was waiting. Cormac drove. I didn't argue about it. We didn't talk much on the way. Unity Point Medical on Brandolin Boulevard was quiet at 4 in the afternoon, the rush of morning appointments done the evening hours not yet begun. A receptionist checked me in and walked me back without the usual waiting room interval, which told me the urgency had been communicated clearly down the line. Doctor Raymond Howell was a man in his mid-50s, methodical and careful, the kind of doctor who has delivered enough difficult information to understand that the delivery matters as much as the content. He shook my hand when I came in. He gestured to the chair across from his desk. He sat down, placed a manila folder on the blotter in front of him, and looked at me for a moment before he touched it. "Mr. Decker," he said, "I'd like you to take a breath before I show you what's here." I looked at him steadily. "Show me." He opened the folder. The report was 3 pages. The first page was standard blood work the panel I had drawn 3 weeks ago at the routine checkup I scheduled every October, the same one I'd had every October for the past 15 years. Most of the markers were what they always were for a man my age in reasonable health. But at the bottom of page 2, a flag section, a referral notation, and clipped behind it a secondary report from a toxicology subspecialty lab in Iowa City dated 4 days ago. "Your standard panel came back with an anomaly," Dr. Howell said. "A compound that doesn't appear in routine metabolic screening because we're not typically looking for it. But some of your markers were inconsistent with normal aging patterns, and I sent a broader panel for evaluation." He paused. "What they found is a synthetic compound. Rare. It's not produced naturally by the body, and it has no legitimate therapeutic application at the concentration levels we found in your bloodstream." The fluorescent light above the desk hummed very faintly. Somewhere down the corridor, a door opened and closed. In small doses administered consistently over time, he continued, "This compound produces a symptom profile that closely resembles early-stage cognitive decline, forgetfulness, difficulty with focus and word retrieval, fatigue, occasional mood dysregulation." He held my gaze. "Mr. Decker, this substance does not appear in the body accidentally. Someone has been introducing it to your system deliberately." The room didn't move. I didn't move. "How long?" I asked. My voice surprised me steadier than it had any right to be. "Based on the accumulation levels in your blood work, approximately 8 months. 8 months. I sat with that number and felt it align. February 2024. The month the court finalized Stellan's placement in my home, and the month Prescott had appeared at my door with a bag from a health food store and a wide practice smile. "Dad, you need to take care of yourself. Eleanor would have wanted that. 2 capsules every morning with coffee, 8 months of mornings." He waited until the boy moved in. I said quietly, "Doctor?" Howell looked up from the folder. "I'm sorry, nothing." I shook my head. "Please continue." Imai explained the medical steps forward: a full detox protocol, additional monitoring, a specialist referral in Des Moines. He said the compound's half-life meant that cessation of exposure would begin to show cognitive improvement within 4 to 6 weeks. He said I was fortunate the accumulation hadn't gone further. He said a lot of things that I heard and filed and would need to read again later, when my brain was doing something other than processing the shape of what my son had built. When he finished, I sat for a while without speaking. I looked at my hands in my lap. I had noticed them recently, the occasional tremor when I was tired, the way they sometimes moved a half-second behind what I was thinking. I had chalked it up to 71 years, and the winter coming, and not sleeping well. I had taken the capsules that were supposed to help, and felt grateful that someone was paying attention to me. Grateful. I thought about every morning I had shaken 2 capsules into my palm and swallowed them with the first coffee of the day. The small ceremony of it. The way I had come to associate the gesture with being cared for, with being a man whose son, whatever their complicated histories, still thought about, whether his father was taking care of himself. I had held on to that. Even when I was filing police reports and installing cameras and standing in the dark behind curtains, some part of me had held on to the idea that the vitamins meant something real. Eleanor would have wanted you to take care of yourself. He had said her name. He had put her name on it. I pressed the heels of my hands against my eyes. I am not a man who cries often or willingly, but there is a specific grief that comes from discovering that you love someone through the very act they designed to destroy you, and it does not ask for your dignity before it arrives. I sat in the chair across from Dr. Howell's desk and let it come for a moment. Not from myself, not even entirely from anger, but from the particular sorrow of a father who finally understands that the child he raised and worried over and tried to reach across 40 years of difficulty is someone he will never be able to fix. That the damage Prescott carries did not come from my failures and will not be solved by my forgiveness, and has already cost more than I can calculate sitting in a clinic chair on a Friday afternoon in October. I loved him anyway. I don't know what that says about me. Maybe nothing good. After a moment, I took my hands away from my face, straightened in the chair, thanked Dr. Howell in a voice that had settled back into something functional, because whatever I was feeling was mine to carry and his to witness, and he had already done his part with precision and care. Outside in the waiting room, Cormac was in the far corner, chair hands folded, not looking at his phone. He looked up when I came through the door. I didn't need to tell him. He read it in the way I was standing. "Call Detective Whitmore," I said. "Tell him we have everything he needs." Cormac nodded. He was already reaching for his phone. By 8:30 that evening, we were all in Cordelia's living room. I don't know that I had ever fully understood the phrase, "the people who showed up," until I sat in that room and looked at the faces around the table. Cormac in the chair by the window, hands folded, the composed stillness of a man who has spent 6 months watching and waiting for this night. Lavinia on the sofa, her coat still on, as if part of her wasn't sure she'd been allowed to stay. Cordelia at the head of the table, a pot of tea no one had touched yet, steaming gently in the center, and Detective Garrison Whitmore, 45 years old, in a gray suit that had been worn through a long day and showed it, setting a laptop on the table with the unhurried efficiency of a man who has run enough of these conversations to know that the room needs a moment to settle before it can absorb what's coming. He looked around once, met each set of eyes briefly without performance. "All right," he said. "Let me show you what we have." I looked at the faces around that table and thought about Eleanor, about how she had set this in motion from a hospital bed, arranging people she trusted into positions she calculated they would need to occupy. Cormac, who had kept his post for 6 months without acknowledgement. Cordelia, who had packed her boxes and driven to Cedar Falls and installed herself next door with the quiet purposefulness of a woman who knew exactly what she was walking into. Lavinia, who had spent 2 years documenting a man she was still legally afraid of. Eleanor had not misjudged a single one of them. Garrison opened the laptop and turned the screen so the room could see. The footage was time-stamped, clear the camera angle, taking in the full length of my kitchen counter from the coffee maker to the far wall. "Third Saturday in September," Garrison said. Prescott Decker's second visit to the residence after Stellan's placement. He clicked play. The footage showed Prescott entering the kitchen, relaxed, familiar with the space, moving to the counter, with the ease of a man in his own territory. He set a paper bag down, reached inside, took out a new vitamin bottle, and then, with the unhurried deliberateness of someone who had done this before and was not concerned about being observed, he picked up the existing bottle from the counter, placed the new one in its position, and put the original in the paper bag. He spent 11 seconds on the exchange. Then he called toward the back of the house in a cheerful voice, asking if Stellan wanted to kick the soccer ball around. The room was completely silent. "He did it twice," Garrison said. "Same process. Third Saturday of September, and again in mid-October, 4 days before Mr. Decker's blood draw." He closed the laptop. That footage, combined with the toxicology report from Unity Point and the medical analysis of the compound's accumulation rate, gives us documented evidence of deliberate poisoning with premeditation. It is sufficient for an arrest warrant. It is more than sufficient for prosecution. Lavinia pressed both hands over her face. The sound she made was short and quiet, the sound of someone who has been holding their breath for 2 years and has just been given permission to let it go. Cormac turned to look out the window. His jaw was set. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. Cordelia sat with both hands flat on the table, her expression the controlled steadiness of a woman who has presided over more catastrophes than most people will ever witness, and who has learned that the moment of revelation is not the moment to fall apart. That comes later privately in the kitchen, at 2 a.m. when no one is watching. The scratch on the back door lock. Garrison continued giving the room a moment before he moved on. Our forensics unit examined it. It was made deliberately from inside the residence using a blade tool. The angle and pressure profile are consistent with someone creating the mark intentionally rather than incidentally. He looked at me. He made it himself, Mr. Decker, during a visit. He wanted you looking outward, watching the street, checking your locks, frightened of a threat coming from outside your house. While the actual mechanism was sitting on your kitchen counter every morning, I had already understood it in the abstract. Hearing it said plainly in a room with other people made it land differently. The trust, I said. Garrison nodded. Eleanor Decker established a trust for Stellan, $340,000, restricted until Stellan's 18th birthday, managed by his legal guardian. He paused. With a forged will positioning Prescott as the likely guardian candidate, and a successful guardianship petition supported by falsified evidence of your cognitive decline, Prescott would have controlled that trust, in addition to the estate assets and the property. He let that sit for a moment. He was also paying someone to monitor the household. We've identified the individual. They've agreed to cooperate in exchange for reduced charges. 6 months of behavioral observation, reports on both you and Stellan, specifically documenting your emotional responses to the child. He was mapping your psychological pressure points. Lavinia lowered her hands. Her eyes were dry now, the way eyes go dry after they've already done what they needed to do. He never cared about Stellan, she said. It wasn't a question. It was the final closing of a door she had been holding open for years, just in case. No, Garrison said, not unkindly. The room absorbed that. I sat with my back straight and my hands on the table in front of me. I thought about a 6-year-old boy upstairs in a house on Maple Grove, asleep with his teddy bear, dreaming whatever 6-year-olds dream when the adults around them are quietly dismantling a trap that was built to use him. He did not know. He would need to know some version of it eventually in the careful language that child specialists use to tell children the parts of the truth that are theirs to carry, but not tonight. What's next? I asked. Garrison looked at me with the directness of a man who respects a question that gets to the point. We end this, he said. I'm filing for the warrant tonight. He closed his laptop and picked it up, stood, straightened his jacket, and moved toward the hallway. At the doorway, he stopped. One more thing. He turned back. His voice had shifted, still professional, but with the weight of something operational behind it. We need Prescott to have no indication that we know anything. For the next 48 hours. No contact with him, no changes in routine, that he might notice nothing that gives him reason to move assets or leave the state. He looked around the room. Can everyone in this room do that? The 4 of us looked at each other. 48 hours. I nodded first. Those 48 hours were the slowest of my life. I mean that precisely. Not the weeks after Eleanor died, not the morning I sat in a probate attorney's office reading a will that wasn't hers. Those were devastating in their own right. But the 2 days between Garrison leaving Cordelia's living room and the Monday that followed had the quality of time that simply refuses to move. I went through the ordinary motions meal, school drop-off, telling Stellan everything was fine. I don't think I lied to him. Everything was going to be fine. It just wasn't fine yet. Monday came in cold and clear. I was up before 5:30 without the alarm lying in the dark, listening to the house settle around me. Quiet upstairs. Stellan still asleep. I got up, went to the kitchen, and picked up an apple from the bowl. I cut it into rabbits. The blade moved cleanly, steadily, following a path my hands had memorized across 47 years of breakfasts and one particular September morning that felt like a different lifetime. And when I set the knife down and looked at the 12 small shapes arranged on Stellan's blue plate, I noticed something that stopped me. My hands were not shaking. For the first time in 8 months, they were entirely unambiguously still. Stellan came down at 7:15 hair, flattened from sleep, and stopped when he saw the plate. "Grandpa, you look different today." I smiled at him across the counter. "I feel different, buddy." And that was the truth. At 8 o'clock that morning, Detective Garrison Whitmore and two uniformed officers entered the offices of Whitfield and Associates on College Street. Prescott was in a conference room. He stood when they came in, listened to the charges being read, and submitted to the handcuffs with the composure of a man who had already decided how he was going to carry himself through whatever came next. Before they walked him out, he looked directly into the security camera above the conference room door and smiled thin, brief, entirely self-contained. The smile of a man who has not yet decided to be afraid. Garrison told me about the smile afterward. I was glad I hadn't been there to see it in person. The initial appearance was held at Black Hawk County District Court in Waterloo that same afternoon. 3 months later, in February, the trial began. I sat in the second row with Cormac to my left and Cordelia to my right in a room that smelled of wood polish and institutional carpet and the accumulated weights of a great many difficult days. Cordelia presented the documentation, first the 11-year-old fraud case, the insufficient evidence finding the victim's original testimony. Her voice in that room was steady and precise, the voice of a woman who has spoken before judges and has never confused composure with indifference. Lavinia was called to the stand. She walked to the box in a dark green coat, sat down, folded her hands, and spoke. The first sentence trembled. The second did not. By the third, she was clear, answering each question with the exactness of someone who has been rehearsing the truth for 2 years and has finally been given the right room for it. She described the call, the threat, the recording, the silence agreement, the drive to Dubuque, her mother's voice afterward on the phone, shaking. She did not look at Prescott once. Cormac confirmed Eleanor's instructions. Brief, exact, unhesitating. The account of a man who made a commitment and honored it without deviation. Doctor, Howell presented the toxicology findings. Compound identification, accumulation, rate 8 months of consistent exposure. He used the phrase intentional poisoning with premeditation twice. The second time, someone in the gallery made a sound and then went quiet. Then the kitchen footage played. 11 seconds. Prescott at my counter swapping the vitamin bottle with the ease of someone who had done it before and expected to do it again. His hand on the new bottle, setting it exactly where the old one had been. His voice calling down the hallway, cheerful, unhurried, warm. The courtroom was completely still. At some point, Prescott turned in his seat and found me across the room. We looked at each other without speaking long enough that it required a decision to hold, not to slide away. His mouth moved slightly, not the smile from the security footage, something smaller, something that said he had already reclassified the situation into whatever internal category let him remain undisturbed by it. For the first time in 71 years, I did not look away. The judge called a recess at 1:45. Court will resume at 2 o'clock. I walked out into the corridor and sat down on the wooden bench outside courtroom 3. Closed my eyes. The hallway noise moved around me. Footsteps, a distant phone, the muffled sound of another proceeding somewhere down the hall. Then a hand settled on my shoulder. Cormac sat down beside me. He didn't say anything. I didn't say anything. We sat together on that bench in a Waterloo courthouse on the first hard Monday of November. And the silence between us was the kind that doesn't need to be filled. The silence of two people who have been carrying the same weight from opposite ends and have finally set it down in the same place. Eleanor had known what she was doing when she found him. At 2 o'clock, the judge walked in. Everyone rose. I rose with them slowly, the way I do most things now, but fully upright, spine straight, without reaching for the chair back to steady myself. It was a small thing. It didn't feel small. I looked straight ahead at a fixed point on the wall above the bench. Not at Prescott, not at Garrison or Cordelia or the gallery behind me. Just that point on the wall, pale and unchanging, while the room settled and the judge opened the folder in front of her and began to read. I thought about the morning Stellan arrived. February, 7 months after Eleanor died. A Thursday that was gray all the way down to the pavement. Prescott had signed the temporary guardianship papers in the courthouse lobby without ceremony, then left without looking back. 20 minutes later, A social services caseworker had pulled up in front of my house, and Stellan had climbed out of the back seat holding a small blue suitcase with both hands. His eyes red from crying. He'd probably been doing the whole drive over. I had gone down the porch steps and crouched on the front walk to put myself at his eye level. "This is your home for as long as you need it, buddy." I hadn't known then what that promise was going to cost. I hadn't known what it was going to mean to keep it. The judge read the charges in sequence: intentional poisoning with premeditation, forgery of legal documents, conspiracy to commit financial fraud, psychological abuse of a minor. She read each one in the same even-measured tone, and the courtroom absorbed them in the particular silence of a room full of people who have already processed their shock and are now simply waiting for the formal shape of what they already know. The sentence, 18 years, imposed as consecutive terms across all counts: intentional poisoning, forgery, financial fraud, and psychological abuse of a minor. No early parole consideration on the poisoning charge. Prescott stood for it with the same composure he had had since the moment Garrison walked into that conference room. He was escorted out through the side door, and he walked without looking back, not at me, not at Lavinia, not at any of the people whose lives he had spent 4 years trying to dismantle. He simply walked through the door, and it closed behind him, and the room let out a breath it had been holding for a very long time. I sat back down. Cordelia placed her hand briefly over mine on the armrest, just for a second. The touch of a woman who has presided over enough endings to know that the moment after a verdict is not the moment for words. Then she removed it and straightened in her seat, and we sat together in the quiet while the courtroom began to empty around us. I had opened it the night before the trial, alone in the kitchen after Stellan was asleep, the house quiet around me, the way it only gets after 10. I plugged it in at the kitchen table and put one earbud in just one, the way Eleanor and I used to share them on long car trips, and I listened. Her voice was exactly as I remembered it, not the voice from the hospital, careful and tired, the earlier one. The one that used to call up the stairs to tell me dinner was ready, that used to say my name in the particular way that meant she was about to tell me something I needed to hear. She told me she loved me. She told me she was sorry she hadn't arranged things more simply. She said she knew I would be angry at first, and she asked me to be angry and then let it go. She said Stellan was going to be fine. She believed that the way she believed in things she couldn't prove fully and without apology. I sat at that kitchen table for a long time after it ended. Then I closed the laptop, put the USB back in the drawer, and went to bed. Spring came to Cedar Falls early that year. By the middle of March, the tulips in Cordelia's front yard were already pushing through the soil with the determined confidence of things that have been underground for a long time and are ready to be done with it. The maple outside my kitchen window was budding new green, at the tips of every branch the particular color that only exists for about 2 weeks before it darkens into ordinary summer. I'd been watching it every morning from the counter while I made coffee. My hands were steady, had been for months. It was a Saturday afternoon in early April when the 5 of us ended up on the back porch, or 4 of us on the porch, and one running wide circles in the yard below, with the limitless energy of a 7-year-old who has been cooped up by an Iowa winter and is making up for lost time. Stellan laughed at something I couldn't see. What? Some private game he was playing with himself out near the fence, and the sound of it came up to the porch clean and unguarded and entirely his own. Not the careful watching laugh he had come to me with in February of last year, his real one. I had been waiting 8 months to hear it. Cormac was in the chair beside mine, both hands around his coffee mug, watching the yard. He'd been coming by on Saturday since November, not by invitation exactly, but by the kind of quiet mutual agreement that forms between people who've been through something together and find that they don't quite know how to stop showing up for each other. Cordelia came around the side of the house with a plate covered in a dish towel, the smell arriving before she did, warm apple cinnamon butter, the particular combination that Eleanor had put into her recipe, and that Cordelia had somehow replicated from a handwritten card she'd found tucked inside one of the cookbooks when she helped me reorganize the kitchen shelves. I hadn't asked her how she'd found it. Some things you just accept. My phone buzzed on the armrest. Portland area code. Lavinia's voice was lighter than I'd heard it in years, possibly ever. She was working at a legal aid office, she said. Small cases, real people. She liked it. She asked about Stellan, which she always did first, and I told her he'd just learned to whistle and considered this a major personal achievement. She laughed. After I hung up, Stellan came barreling up the porch steps 2 at a time. "Grandpa, come on." He was already pulling at my sleeve with both hands. Cormac said he'd show me how to throw a curveball, and he keeps stalling. I looked over at Cormac, who was studying his coffee mug with the concentrated attention of a man who has absolutely no idea what anyone is talking about. "I don't stall," Cormac said. "You've been stalling for 20 minutes, Stellan said, with the merciless accuracy of a 7-year-old. I stood up. Slowly, the way I always do, now deliberately with full attention to the process. Because I've learned to pay attention to the things I used to take for granted. I came down the porch steps and Stellan immediately transferred his grip to my hand and began pulling. I looked up. The sky above Cedar Falls was the particular blue of an early Iowa spring, washed clean by the last of the winter, and not yet hazed by summer heat. The tulips in Cordelia's yard threw short shadows on the new grass. Somewhere in the house behind me was a kitchen drawer with a small black USB drive in it, labeled in Eleanor's handwriting, waiting for a day when I needed to hear her voice. She was in there. She would always be in there whenever I needed her. She had known all of it. She had always known. Stellan pulled harder, and I smiled the full, uncomplicated kind and let him lead me out into the yard. I never thought my family story would end like this. An old man of 71, sitting on a porch in the spring sunshine, watching his grandson laugh after everything that tried to take that moment away from us. Family betrayal doesn't always come from strangers. Sometimes it walks through your front door, wearing your son's face and carrying a gift bag. I know that now. I learned it the hard way. So, let me say what I wish someone had told me sooner. Don't do what I did. Don't let love blind you. Don't let loyalty silence your instincts. Every family betrayal begins the moment we stop paying attention to the small things that don't feel right. I'm not a preacher, but I believe God places the right people beside us exactly when we need them most. Cormac, Cordelia, Lavinia, none of them shared my blood. All of them saved my life. That's my family story, and my personal truth family is not who you're born to. Family is who stays. Every family story deserves to be told. If this one reached you, leave a comment and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe so you never miss what comes next. We read every single one. Thank you for staying until the very end. A gentle reminder, upcoming stories contain some fictional elements crafted purely for reflection and awareness. If that's not your preference, feel free to step away and choose content that better suits you. No judgment here.